Control drag from the thing that you want to start the segue over to the view controller you want it to segue to. Okay? When you let go of the mouse, it's going to put this little black thing up and ask what kind of segue do you want here. And in this context, there's only three that make sense. Push, which would be navigation controller 1. Modal, which we'll talk about later, which is take over the screen segue. I teach you that late because that can be abused. Okay, we don't want to do that too much. And then custom, you can create your own segues. We're not even going to talk about that in this class. That's so rare. All right, so I click push, and it puts this little thing in between my MVCs. You see that little round thing? That's a segue. Okay? And this is a clickable thing. In fact, you're going to need to click on it, because when you click on it and you go to the attributes inspector, you'll see that it has two things actually. One is the type of segue, which is push, but above that it has this identifier. Okay, I've called this segue the do something segue. Now, why do I need to put this identifier here? And actually, it's pretty much mandatory to put something here. And the reason is that I need to identify this segue in my code. Okay, this is the link, tenuous as one might argue it is, between Xcode and your code when it comes to a segue. Okay, we essentially name these segues, we give them identifiers, strings, and then in our code we can refer to them. And you'll see in a few slides here where in our code we refer to this, but it's very important to do that. Okay, another common thing, this is a common thing to forget. You create a segue, you go to your code, and you're like, oh, ooh, and then you have to end up going back to Xcode and naming it. This one, you're less likely to get very far without remembering to go back, but it's still something that's commonly forgotten. All right, so we're going to call this segue the do something segue. You usually want to pick an identifier that describes in some, just like a variable name would describe what's going on here. So this is a generic example, so when we click that button, we're going to do something, so I called it do something. But you'd probably want to pick a better name than do something. That's a little generic, okay? Okay, so there's a problem here, though. If I were to run my application in this state, it would not work. Okay, clicking that button would not segue. Why is that? Because this whole thing has to be in a navigation controller, right? These two MVCs, I need a third MVC, which is the navigation controller they're in. Okay, so let's talk about how to do that. It's very simple. You pick which one of these you want to be the root view controller, right, of the navigation controller. And you go to the editor menu and say embed in navigation controller. So I've picked the one on the left. You see it's got the dark blue line around it. I say embed in navigation controller. And when I do that, boom, it's going to create a navigation controller. So now I have three MVCs in this storyboard. Three. I've got the navigation controller on the left, and then I've got my two other ones on the right. Okay? And the little arrow on the very left, do you see that arrow that kind of points in from the left? That's the MVC that's going to be on screen when your application launches. And that little arrow can actually be picked up and moved around. Just pick it up and drop it on any MVC you want. That's going to be the MVC when you start. Now, it used to be pointing at the MVC that has the word button in it there in the middle, but as soon as I embedded it in a navigation controller, it automatically moved it out to the navigation controller. It would never make sense to have a little arrow pointing to an MVC that's inside a navigation controller, okay? Because that doesn't mean bring up the navigation controller and have this be the root view controller. That would just mean something strange. I'm not even sure why Xcode allows that, but it wouldn't work. When it came up, there would be no navigation controller because you'd be bypassing the navigation controller. So, but you can drag that little arrow to a tab bar controller, or if sometimes in testing, it's nice to move them to a view controller and just say, oh, just start with this view controller. Because remember, these view controllers are supposed to stand on their own. So you can sometimes drag it to start it for testing and then drag it back. In fact, I'll try and do that if we have time in the demo today. Okay? This second little thing there, that looks like a segue, but it's not actually. That's actually just showing you the root view controller connection from the navigation controller. Okay? So when you see the little kind of, it looks like a line with two dots in there, that means it's a kind of an outlet type of connection, not a segue. It looks very similar, but you can't inspect it, you can't set an identifier, none of that's necessary here. It's just showing you that connection. But this one, that is the segue, the thing that we control dragged a few slides ago. Okay, if I were to click on that, it would say identifier, do something, etc. And notice that every single one of the scenes that is now inside this navigation controller, not just the root view controller, but everything it can navigate to with push segues, gets a bar on the top in Xcode. And that's so you can lay out your UI nicely, knowing that that bar is always going to be on top of that scene, because this thing is inside a navigation controller. Okay? And if you added toolbar items, things, then it would have a bar in the bottom as well. If this was all inside a tab bar controller, which is legal and which you're going to be doing for your homework, then it would also have a bar for the tab bar. And so the UI would be squinching down, so you have to make your UI fit. And again, next week or the week after, I guess, we're going to talk about auto layout, which is a way, as these things are appearing or disappearing, these bars in the top and bottom, to automatically have that stuff rearranged. But for now, you're going to have to manually do it. Okay? You can double-click on the title in these bars and set the title if you want, or it'll ask the view controller that's at that scene for its title, just using the title property. And you can also, if you wanted to add a button at the top, remember the calendar has like the search button and the add button and the edit button at the top. The way you do that is you just drag a button in, but don't use UI button here. Okay? Well, you'll be frustrated if you try to drag UI button. It's like, how come the UI button won't go there? And that's because we use UI bar button item, which is kind of a lighter weight one. You scroll down almost to the bottom of the palette, you'll see this thing, bar button item. You drag that out, you'll see that it will drop there. And when you let it go, now you have a button there called item. That button will only appear when this MVC, the one that has button in the middle of it, is the currently visible thing in the navigation controller. That's the only time the item will appear. Okay? And it is perfectly legal to, instead of having our segue go from button to the next one, we could control drag from that item to the next one. In fact, I'll do that in the demo just to show you. Okay? So that item button at the top is allowed to be a source of segueing. In fact, it very commonly is. All right? Okay. So we talked about pushing this stuff on. Okay? That's how you get something to appear, the segue. Push segue. How about coming off? Well, normally things are coming off by the user hitting the back button. And that's when you want it to happen. You want the user to feel in control of their diving down for detail and coming back. So you want that back button to work. But there are a few times when it makes sense to programmatically do it. And one example is, let's say you dive down and you're showing some employee record, and a button in there is delete, meaning delete this employee. Well, if you hit that delete button, it doesn't make any sense to be here anymore because that employee is gone. So you want to go back. Okay, you want to go back to the previous level. And so you can call this method in UI navigation controller called pop view controller animated. We almost always specify yes, by the way, in animation. You don't want your UI jumping around. You want things sliding in and fading in and stuff like that. And we're going to talk a lot about animation in the next couple weeks of your own stuff. But you might ask, how do I get a hold of my UI navigation controller to send it this message? And an awesome thing about this way it's all set up is if you are a view controller and you are inside a navigation controller anywhere on its stack, you can call the you can get the property on yourself called navigation controller, and it will return you the navigation controller you're in. Does that make sense? If you're not in a navigation controller, it'll just return nil. And it's perfectly reasonable to have MVCs that can live in a navigation controller, or live in a tab bar controller, or live in a navigation controller that's inside a tab bar controller, or live on their own, or live in a modal situation, whatever. You want to have MVCs that are flexible about where they live. So sometimes this will return nil, and you might say, if I'm in a navigation controller, then pop. If I'm not, then do something else. All right? So self.navigation controller is a good thing to know inside a controller. It tells you the view controller you're in. There's also self.tabbar controller. You can find out the tab bar controller you're in, although you almost never need that. But navigation controller you do if you're going to pop or do some other things. What other segues are there besides push? I mentioned the modal and pop over. There's also a replace, which is an iPad-only thing, and there's custom ones. We'll talk about iPad stuff in a few lectures, and we'll cover all that then. And again, we'll talk about modal later because it's kind of easily abused. Okay, so now let's talk about what happens in code when a segue happens. We already know what happens on screen, which is this new MVC slides in, right? Like the month slides into the day slides into the event, whatever. So they slide in as you click on them. But what's happening in your code? Well, there's an important thing that needs to happen before a new MVC can slide in, which is that it needs to be prepared. So let's go back to the example of the calendar. When I click on that, let's say I got a month view showing the calendar, and I pick on a day, and now it's going to slide in and show me a day. I need to tell that day MVC what day, okay? Because that day MVC, I guess it could just always show today, but if you're a calendar app, you want it to be able to show other days. So you need to prepare that day MVC to come on screen by telling it what day. Okay, once you tell it what day, it's on its own. It just goes off, shows the day, you scroll around, you know, if you click on a thing, it's the one that pushes again to push in the event detail one, but you got to prepare it. Okay, so MVCs need to be prepared. Well, who does the preparation? Obviously, it's the MVC that you clicked in to cause this other MVC to slide in. So in the example we just did, the MVC that has the button in it, it should have a method in it, prepare for Segue, that prepares the next one over, the one on the right, to come on screen. The month one has to have a prepare for Segue that prepares a day view controller for coming on screen. So what does this prepare for Segue code look like? Okay, first of all, it's called prepare for Segue : sender : Don't worry about that sender argument for now. We'll talk about when that's useful. It's a pretty rare case. Normally, you just need the information that's in that first argument, the UI storyboard Segue. You see that UI storyboard Segue? If you go look at that class, you'll see that there's a couple of very interesting properties on it. One interesting property is identifier. That's that string we typed in Xcode, do something. Remember that? So when you get this prepare for Segue, the first thing you're going to do is look at the identifier of the Segue to see which Segue we're talking about. Now, why do we even need to do that? The answer is we can have multiple things Segue. So again, let's go back to the month view. I can click on a day, and it can segue to a day view. But maybe I click on the edit or something like that, and it could segue to some view that edits something about the month. Okay, like do they start on Sundays or do they start on Mondays? That kind of view. You see what I mean? So it could segue to a different one. So you could have two different controls inside the month view that are segueing to different MVCs. So we need to know, we know which one it is by its identifier. Okay, so once we've checked to see which one we're talking about here, and we always do that, even if there's only one Segue, we always check the identifier, just to make sure we're in sync with what we put in our storyboard. And because someday we might add another Segue with a different identifier. Then the next thing we do is we're going to say, what MVC are we segueing to? Okay? Usually we are going to know what class of thing it is, or think we know, because we know the identifier of the Segue. So it only makes sense. If you're a month view and you click on that day, that thing it's segueing to better be a day view controller, because you don't know what else to do if it's not. Okay? But you still, even so, will usually do a Segue destination view controller is kind of class, the view controller we expect. Then we'll make a little local variable with it. And then we're going to do VC, which is our little local variable, dot needed info equals. Well, that's kind of pseudocode for preparing that day view controller. So if this were the day view example, probably it would say do VC dot date equals some NS date, right? And so now we've prepared the day thing. And that's all we do here. Everything else happens by magic. Once we've prepared that new MVC, it goes on screen and does what it does. We don't have to do anything to make things slide or animate. That's all handled by the system. All the system is asking right here is please prepare this MVC to come on screen. Now, very important thing to understand here. When this is called, your outlets are not set in the destination MVC. Okay? So this is between awake from nib and view did load. This is very annoying. Okay? I wish this was different. I'm sure there must be a good reason why this is the way it is, but it's very annoying because it means that any information that you're passing, like the day, to the day view, it has to kind of hold on to it until all its outlets are set, and then in view did load, it can go update all its UI. Does that make sense what I just said? Right? So you're going to have properties that are going to have to hold on to the day, and then when view did load happens, then it can update the UI. And I'm going to show you in the demo kind of a way that we might do it that's somewhat boilerplate or somewhat kind of a, I don't know if I want to go so far as to say best practice, simple practice for doing that, for dealing with the fact that this gets called before view did load, okay, before your outlets are set. Okay. So it is possible to prevent a Segue. I have a few other slides, by the way, that I'm not going over in lecture, but they're on what you downloaded, so you can kind of read through them and look at the documentation to figure it out.